Morena koutou, ko Roanne Sutherland tuku ingoa, no tauranga Aotearoa ahau, ko te papa atawhai wahi mahi. So, good morning, my name's Roanne Sutherland and I work for the Department of Conservation. And we're doing a shared talk today, and it was in conjunction with MPI, so I'm going to introduce Jazz Hessel. She works for the Biosecurity New Zealand at MPI, and she's been part of this as well.
Kia ora, ko Beccy Ganley toku noa, he kairataki o ngā raka takitaki ahau, e mahi ana ahau ki te rangahau aha marakai. So my name is Beccy Ganley. I work at Plant and Food Research and I lead Ngā Rako Takitaki, which is a research program, which I'll talk about later. And so we're going to talk to you about New Zealand, if I can figure out this thing. First off, I'd just like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of Aotearoa Nation, traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today, and thank them for their kind welcome. We pay our respects to the elders past and present, and we extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. And nā iwi o Aotearoa, tēnā koutou katoa. So we're going to start off as myrtle rust has been in New Zealand for a shorter period of time than it has been in Australia. And so we're going to start off for us at the very start, which is incursion response. And I realise that there's probably a lot of people in the room who don't necessarily know what's happened since it arrived in New Zealand. So March 2017, the Department of Conservation, which is where Roanne works, staff detected it on Rangatahua, Roe Island, Kemetic Islands. And that's a set of islands which is north of mainland New Zealand. And the first observations were on Metrosideros kumekidensis, Kahika Rangatahua. In 2017, a biosecurity response was initiated by MPI, and that's the organisation that Jasmine works at, and it was confirmed that it was myrtle rust. A delimitating survey was undertaken, and the results from that was that it was considered not feasible to eradicate. In May 2017, myrtle rust was confirmed on mainland New Zealand in a nursery up in Kerikeri, which is in the top of the North Island. And then very shortly afterwards, it was found in Taranaki, which is in the west side of our North Island, and Te Kuiti, and then in Te Puke, which is more on the east side of the North Island. We had the response, which was Ministry for Primary Industries, DOC, iwi, local authorities, nursery industries, which attempted to contain and control myrtle rust, but at the same time see how far it had spread across New Zealand. And the objective of it was to contain and suppress infection, had a lot of tracing to look to see where the rust had potentially may have come from. And the results from that is it appeared that all of the sites that were infections were independent infection events, which had happened through in the early months of 2017. So in keeping with that as well, MPI looked to see what events had happened between Australia and New Zealand. I'm not sure if you were aware, but there's actually a lot of wind events that have the ability to carry rust spores from Australia to New Zealand, but they also do go back the other way. So there's a lot of reasons why New Zealand and Australia, in particular around myrtle rust, need to work closely together. And so they know that there's at least 20 wind events that occur annually every year that could transport the rusts from Australia to New Zealand. So the response that we had involved engaging the public to report the findings, identifying affected properties, the delimiting surveys that I had mentioned before as well, surveillance, sample testing, removing infected trees, tracing risk goods to and from infected properties. Had controlled area notices to restrict movement of myrtle plants, a lot of seed collection and seed banking, a good start, but a lot more to do, research and risk assessments. In April 2018, a decision was made to stop the response, and at that stage we had 623 properties across 11 regions, and a huge amount of resources had been deployed. And to put it into context, 95,000 myrtle plants had been assessed, and about 5,000 had been securely removed and destroyed. It was recognised that it wasn't feasible to continue with a incursion response, and so it was moved to a long-term management. And just on the side there, I've got some pictures from the incursion response and our zoot suits going out doing the surveillance. I was part of the response. Would like to thank our Australian colleagues because the information provided was really, really helpful. And I would say, as someone who was on the ground, that the chances that we spread the pathogen during the incursion response was very, very minimal. And that was because of the information that was provided to New Zealand to help us with that incursion response. And now I'm going to hand over to Roanne. Roanne and I are going to do a little bit of a backwards and forth, so it's going to be a bit different from Geoff and Bob's.
Yeah, so where is myrtle rust now? So the map that we're going to show you in a minute, it's come from lots of different places. The data's come from lots of different places. It's come from the response data, and it's also come from iNaturalist. So as you can see there, that it's starting to grow. This is 2018, 2019, 2020, 21, 22, and then where we are today. So as you can see, where we've had positive responses with myrtle rust, it actually meets the climatic risk profile map, and that's a maximum prediction risk match, and so it matches up with where we've seen infection across the country. Most of our reports that we're getting these days, it's coming via citizen science, via iNaturalist, and there's been over 3,000 reports across the country. There's a couple of outliers that we've got here in the South Island of New Zealand. One down the bottom here, so this is on a Pahutakawa seedling that was planted and it's outside of its natural range. And then we've got another one down in Timaru, and so this was infected Pahutakawa seedlings that had been shipped from the North Island and they had arrived in the South Island and they had myrtle rust on them. The landowners had reported it and they actually destroyed those plants at the time. So our season for myrtle rust, it's our summer season, so it starts anywhere around November and it goes all the way through now into June, but the peak of it is between November and April. So what are some of the species that we're seeing that are impacted by myrtle rust? So in New Zealand, we've got 38 native taxa, 28 of them are described across 6 genera. So we've got 10 Kunzea, we've got 2 Leptospermum, which is Kānuka, we've got 2 Lophomirdis, which is Ramarama and Rohutu. We've got 12 different Metrosideros, 1 Neomyrtis, and 1 Syzygium. So our species list is a lot smaller than what Australia is. So the conservation status of all of our Myrtaceae was raised in 2018 after the arrival of myrtle rust. So all of our species, they were elevated to threatened, and they included 16 of them were nationally vulnerable, 10 were nationally critical, and 1 was nationally endangered. And we've got over 200 exotic Myrtaceae species. Some are important commercially. We've got horticulture and forestry, we've got feijoa and eucalyptus. In our urban gardens, we've got bottle brushes and guava and lily pilly. And we've also got the lot that are planted in our botanical gardens. So which one of these have been impacted by myrtle rust? So our Kunzea, our Kānuka species, the 10 of them, we haven't seen any infection in the wild. The Leptospermum Mānuka we have on 1 species. Lophomirdis, Ramarama and Rohutu, they've both been impacted in the wild. And our Metrosideros, that includes our climbing rata as well as our trees. Our single Syzygium species, which is called Mighty Tāwaki or swamp mighty, it's been severely impacted. And then we've got 17 exotic species. So I'm just going to go through some of the species and the impacts that were being seen, not only just in our nurseries, our urban environment, but also in the native forests. So Lophomirdis ballata, also known as Ramarama or bubble leaf. It's a New Zealand endemic species, and its distribution is patchy from across the North Island to the top of the South Island, and it's from the coast up into the mountains. Its preferred habitat is regenerating shrubland and along riverbanks. It's got fleshy, edible fruit, that was a traditional food, and it's also eaten a lot by the native birds. The species is severely impacted. It got infection on leaves, stem, flowers and fruit. The flowering and the fruiting occur during the peak season of the myrtle rust, and the seeds have had significant reduction in viability after freezing. So the traditional method of storing the seeds is not that great for the species. We've had tree death reported after 3 years on the East Cape of the North Island, and seedling death after 1 season. The species also gets impacted by thrip damage on the older leaves. So not only are the new susceptible leaves being impacted by myrtle rust, but the older leaves are being impacted by insect damage. The middle picture there, you can see that the rama is actually dying, and then the flowers below that are being impacted, so sometimes the flowers don't even get to the fruiting stage. So Mairi Tāwaki, it's also another endemic, and it's our only Syzygium species in New Zealand. Its distribution is in the North Island to the top of the South Island, and it loves those waterlogged, swampy areas. It's another plant that's got another fleshy fruit, and these seeds are unable to be stored as they are sensitive to being dried. Again, the flowering and the fruiting occurs during the peak myrtle rust season and is highly impacted. We've seen infection on leaves, stems, flowers and fruit structures. In some areas, we're seeing functional extinction where they're unable to produce any viable seeds. Lophomertus obcordata, or rohutu. It's got patchy distribution across the North and the South Island. Again, it's another species. It's got the fleshy, edible fruit, and it naturally hybridizes with the rama. The hybrids of these two species are fully fertile and highly susceptible to the disease as well. In the North Island, we're seeing infection on the leaves, stems, flowers and fruits. And in the South Island, the infection status is unknown. The flowering and fruiting, again, it occurs during that peak myrtle rust season, and they've been highly affected. The seeds have reduced viability in the traditional seed storing methods, and this is one of the only, along with our Myrtaceae species that got listed as threatened, we also had a dwarf mistletoe as well. So our Aotearoa, this is New Zealand's Christmas tree. It's a beautiful endemic tree, and its distribution occurs in the upper half of the North Island, along our coastal line, and inwards a little bit around our lakes. It's a culturally sacred tree, and it colonises of bare land, rock, and it's a coastal stability. So it really protects our coastline. It's got small, hard seeds that germinate soon after the seed comes in contact with moisture, but most are not viable. It's highly susceptible, and we've seen infection on leaves, stems, flowers, and seed capsules, and on the epicormic shoots. And we've seen increased infection over the last summer between 22 and 23, where we're starting to see dieback of these trees. So we've got tree rata. We've got 3 species, and they're all endemic to New Zealand. We've got rata moehau, or Bartlett's rata, and its distribution is just restricted to the top of the North Island. And it's believed that we've only got 11 individuals remain in wild populations. We've seen infection on nursery seedlings. They seem to be highly susceptible, and on the leaves and the stems, but it's unknown about the wild populations, how susceptible they are. We've got northern rata, and this has got a distribution, it might say northern rata, and you'd think that's just the northern or the North Island, but it actually goes from the North Island to the South Island, and it hybridises with our Aotearoa trees. It's a long-lived tall forest tree, and it usually starts life as an epiphyte. So it's really unknown about the susceptibility, as we don't often get up into the canopy of trees to be able to look at these seedlings. Then we've got the southern rata, and its distribution is to the Northland to the subantarctic Auckland Islands. So it's got quite a wide distribution. Again, it's another tall forest tree. We've seen infection on seedlings in nurseries, but we don't know about wild populations. And then we've got our climbing ratas. Our climbing ratas, we've got 6 species. Again, they're all endemic to New Zealand. We've got Metrosideros cuminea, and this is the distribution in the North Island, and plants are highly susceptible in our urban environments, but we don't actually know what's happening in the wild. Albiflora, again, we've got distribution in the northern North Island, and its infection status is unknown. And then Calenzoi, again, it's in the North Island, so all 3 of these species here sit within the myrtle rust climatic conditions. So they would be our species that were most at risk. And then the other 3 species have got distribution down into the South Island and into the Stewart Island. Then we come to our Manuka and Kanuka, so Leptospermum and Canusia. And so the Manuka, we've seen infection on the leaves and stem and fruit. And then the Kanuka, its distribution varies with species. We've got one species that's got limited just to a single island off of Auckland. And then one of our highly susceptible non-native species, which is Syzygium australia, commonly called lily pilly in New Zealand. It's from the Eastern Australian species. It's grown as hedge lines a lot in our Auckland environment. And it's in New Zealand, it was naturalised in 1983. It's an ornamental, so it's often used as hedges, gardens, shelter belts, and in the nursery trade. Again, it's got a fleshy fruit, and it's severely susceptible to infection. Prune hedges, they create this increased inoculum load because as they prune them, they get new growth and then they get susceptible again. And I'm going to hand it back to Beccy.
Okay, so Roanne sort of talked about what's happening on the ground, and I'm going to change track and talk about what's happening sort of nationwide with it. And so first off, I'm just going to start off with this quote, and it's from John Sanson, who's at Biosecurity New Zealand Ministry for Primary Industries, which is our lead organisation for incursion responses. And so it sort of sums up where we are at the moment. So it's significant efforts have been made to manage and reduce the impacts of myrtle rust across Aotearoa. Following the initial response to myrtle rust, the government's investment focused on science to find new and innovative solutions to protect our taonga species and iconic trees. As the current phase of science investment is coming to a close, our focus will move to understanding the priorities for ongoing research and the transfer of research findings into tools and resources that communities and landowners can use to manage the impacts of myrtle rust. Aligned with this, we will be planning for a refresh of the National Myrtle Rust Strategy and scoping of the future investment needed to deliver further actions such as germplasm collection and resistance breeding. Are you going to talk about the plant pass? Ongoing. Then one of the other things that we have is the New Zealand Plant Pass for the nurseries, and we've identified that the nurseries are a high risk area for spreading of the pathogen, and so this is a biosecurity tool that was more recently released, focusing on biosecurity practices in commercial nurseries. It's voluntary, but they've had really good uptake of it, and it has training modules for myrtle rust and also for Kauri dieback. I'm going to be talking about Kauri dieback later on as well, so I'm just going to mention it now. So we've got 2 diseases in New Zealand that are impacting our natives, myrtle rust and Kauri is the other big one. It's a phytophthora that causes death on tree species Kauri that we have. And so often you'll see in New Zealand a lot of our management or research focuses on dealing with both of them, and this is an example as well for the industries where it's tackling both of these diseases. So as I said before, really good uptake. 74 producers are registered, and the goal is to have 175 nurseries participating. and lots of benefits: improved biosecurity practices in the nurseries, increasing nursery biosecurity risk management, protecting producers and enabling safe movement of plants, not just for myrtle rust and kauri, but a lot of these practices are extending out just generally into the nursery. So likely to have a lot less transmission of pests through our nurseries as this is uptaken. So now on to the fun stuff, and that's the research programs. I'm not going to go into these in real depth, but I did want to give everyone an overview of what's happened, because we've had quite a lot of research in New Zealand, and importantly, links of where you can find it. We've got lots of researchers today who are going to be talking about the research, and also tomorrow and Friday, but just sort of to give you an overview. And so the first one that we start off with is the Catalyst MBIE Fund. So our Catalyst Fund targets international collaboration, so it's specifically a New Zealand and Australian program, Plant Health Australia with Better Border Biosecurity in New Zealand. So there's a lot of people in the room from both Australia and New Zealand who are part of this research program. It was actually submitted a month before we found myrtle rust in New Zealand, talk about timing, and it was funded. Looked at a lot of different things, but just some of the key areas was overseas testing of germplasm collected with cultural approval, and that was against the pandemic, but we also tested against other strains as well that are present in South Africa and Uruguay in particular, and surveillance was part of there. MPI after that also put in 2 programs of research. I'm only also going to talk about the programs. We actually have lots of other little projects that get done, but these are the main programs where there's been significant research undertaken. And these were from 2017 to 2019, lots of different areas in these: surveillance and monitoring, the Australasian genome, social science, susceptibility testing. A lot of our programs too, because we've had it for a short period of time, we have that ability that things might have started off in the Catalyst and then they've moved through the successive programs, and there's actually been really, really good connection. But at the same time, we've also introduced new elements into different programs as well. Epidemiology and host phenology, we had quite a few reviews. Control options, breeding for resistance and seed conservation were some of the key ones. Te Ao Māori was a key focus. Also, we'll say for Māori, all native trees are culturally significant. So they're all considered taonga or treasured, and that is for every single native species we have in New Zealand. So it's incredibly important in impact assessments. And I will just notice on the side, the picture, Myrtle Rust Consortium in 2021 received New Zealand's Science Biosecurity Award for our work on myrtle rust. And there's several faces in there that you'll recognise. A key program that we have up at the moment is the Beyond Myrtle Rust. Got Marge here at the front who leads this program, so if you've got any questions, please go see Marge. And it has a sort of couple key areas: improving the understanding of Australasian cityi reproduction in New Zealand, investigating the broad-scale impacts of the pathogen on ecosystem functions, investigating natural plant and ecosystem resistance to myrtle rust, building capacity and developing strategies to facilitate Māori leadership around myrtle rust management, and understanding motivations for monitoring or reporting myrtle rust in New Zealand and the Pacific. Not long after, the government put aside some funding, strategic science investment for research into both kauri dieback and myrtle rust, and this is called Ngā Rako Takitaki, and this is a program that I lead, which is saving our iconic trees from kauri dieback and myrtle rust. And again, this is one of those ones where there's often key elements when disease management for us that span across both pathogen host systems. In this one here, we've got 7 key areas: oranga, which is Mataranga Māori research, and that's research using traditional Indigenous knowledge. Mobilising for action is about pulling together communities and bringing them on board. Risk assessment and ecosystem impacts is looking at characterising our ecosystems and also collecting really critical baseline data. That was a message that we got loud and clear from our Australian colleagues, so thank you, about how important it was to capture that information. Integrated surveillance, not only surveillance, but looking at data management, data storage, and cultural authority around data. Control, protect, cure is looking at different ways that we could potentially control myrtle rust and also detect it. Host pathogen environment has sections that look at the genome, but also epidemiology. And then conservation and restoration sort of speaks for itself, but in particular in that one, a lot of the research on different ways to store some of the seed for our myrtles, which are difficult to store long term. So hopefully, I've put it all together into one slide. If you ever want to take a photo of my presentation, this is probably the one to do. And it has all of the websites that if you want to find out about what's happening in New Zealand, you should be able to find it from here. The top one is what I would call the mother website, and it's from MPI. Basically, any of the other ones underneath, you can find if you go to that one website. So if you go there, you should be able to find anything else. But I did want to touch on a couple of other things. We have done a science stocktake, so every output that we are aware of that has come from New Zealand since 2008, which is, I think, our first report on myrtle rust, is on this stocktake. And so they're done in different categories, but if you're wanting to look for what's there, it should be on that, and it's regularly updated. The Beyond Myrtle Rust website links to all of the research that's in that program, same with the Ngārako Takitaki website. Also, we have a myrtle rust science strategy in New Zealand. It's actually been really, really good to have that strategy and really helpful for developing programs. Also have a general myrtle rust strategy, so links to both of those. So where are we going? Well, unfortunately, the Beyond Myrtle Rust program ends in June 2024, Ngārako Takitaki in February 2024. We also have quite a significant change to New Zealand's science system that's underway. It's called Te Ara Pairangi. And so at the moment, well, as a scientist, I am very hopeful and expecting that we're going to have new research for myrtle rust that will come through Te Ara Pairangi, but we don't know. So currently we're in a position where we don't have any new funding and research programs and just waiting in limbo to find out what happens with the changes in our science system. The myrtle rust strategy is to be updated. We have delivered as a research community on many of the priorities that are in there, but we didn't deliver on all of them because we never had enough funding in the first place to deliver on them. So we definitely know that we have research gaps. We also have new research and priorities that have come through from the research which needs to be added into that document. I really wanted to acknowledge, as you've probably heard from me several times today, the collaboration, in particular with Australian researchers, but also other international researchers, has just been invaluable. I'd like to say thank you to Perry and everybody else who's helped organise this. It's fantastic for us to continue to connect and maintain those relationships, but also build new relationships with people who've come into the space. So really looking forward to these few days of getting to know everyone and looking for new connections and collaborations. It's been a really helpful part of the whole journey. The final one that I'm going to talk about is connecting and communication. What do we do in New Zealand? We have two sort of main areas of how we connect out across the country. And the first one are the Myrtle Ora community meetings. Ora means health, or thereabouts health. They happen every second month. They're hosted by Ngārako Takitaki, open to anyone who's involved in myrtle rust. And so specifically in those meetings, we have updates and discussions from researchers, government agencies and community. If you're interested, email that email and say you'd like to come along and you'll get sent the link to join into them. And even though myrtle rust or Ngārako Takitaki ends in February, these will continue on. They've been a really, really important part of making sure that we connect across the country. The other one that I wanted to mention was the Beyond Myrtle Rust webinar series. They have national and international presentations regularly throughout the year. They're virtually presented, but they're recorded, so you can go and have a look at them online afterwards. So, and also put the website for that one up there as well. And then the very, very final one is just to acknowledge that Roanne and I have come up and spoken today, but we speak on behalf of a huge team of researchers in New Zealand. The iwi of New Zealand have been an integral part of our response and the way forward for myrtle rust, and we have a huge number of organisations and groups who've also been part of this journey. So just want to acknowledge that it is a real team effort. And on that note, on behalf of Roanne and I, thank you very much.